Dear friends, welcome to another lecture being organized by Asha and Ganga Jamni Heritage. We are in India, we in India are actually passing through a very rough patch. Today we stand second position from the top as far as COVID cases are concerned. That too when all our sources indicate that the exact real figures are not being revealed by the government. Hope all of you remain safe. Please stay at home and follow all the prescribed protocols. Today, we have another great scholar with us, and he is connecting with us from the country which allegedly has the highest reported COVID-19 cases in the world, the great United States of America. Dr. Ali Anooshahr is a professor of history at the University of California, Davis. He focuses on Indo-Persian history and culture as well as comparative Islamic empires. His publications include The Ghazi Sultans and the Frontiers of Islam, which was published by Routledge in 2009. His second book is Turkestan and the Rise of Eurasian Empires, published in 2018 by Oxford. And a third book is Mughal Empire from Jahangir to Shah Jahan, published by the Mark Foundation in 2019, which he co-edited along with Professor Abakosh. He has also a large number of published articles on Indo-Persian scholarly networks network connection between Shiraz, Bijapur, and Agra, and on chronicles such as Badayuni, Mushtaqi, Mir Muhammad Masum Bhakkari, Mirza Haider Doglat, Jafar Beg Qazvini, and others. Ali is also on the editorial board of JESHO, that is Journal of Economic and Social History Review. I still cherish my brief interactions with him at Sorbonne in Paris way back in March 2008, when he came to listen to my haywire talk on the town planning of Fatehpur Sikri, organized by Dr. Nalini Francois Delvoye. Since then, I have off and on been in contact with him via email. Today, he will speak on the idol of Ghazni. What do Perso-Arabic sources actually say about Sultan Mahmud? Through this lecture, he will try to unravel before us how do we know what we know about Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. Almost all of our information goes back to two contemporary chronicles, one of them in Persian and another in Arabic, and a divan from the early 11th century. The Arabic text is the Tarikh-e-Yamini, written by Abu Nasr al-Udbi, and the Persian chronicle is the Zainul Akhbar by Gardezi. All subsequent Persian chronicles drew on the latter Persian translation of Yamini. After the Mughal period, a few used Gardezi as well. In the 19th century, H.M. Elliot translated parts of the Persian translation of Udbi into English, which popularized that particular version of events in modern scholarship. This uncritical over-reliance on a single source has led to perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of medieval Indian history. And this is what he's going to unravel for us today. Let us see what Dr. Ali Anooshahr is going to tell us. Over to you, Ali.
Good morning, everybody. Excuse me. Well, I wanted to start by thanking Professor Razavi for inviting me. Excuse me. And for Shagufta Siddi for helping, setting up the talk. It's a great honor to be here. I'm glad that I can be in Aligarh virtually and hopefully one day in person as soon as we get past all the pandemic and everybody gets vaccinated, I hope soon. So it's a great pleasure to be here. And the title of the talk is actually based on a small phrase in the book by Professor Muhammad Habib in 1927, who wrote his book on Sultan Mahmud. And in the preface, he says that he says there are some people at the time who were treating Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni as a saint. And he says, I am against this idea. And he said, I quote, "We want no idols." What did he mean by that? Well, I think on the one hand, he mean that Mahmud of Ghazni was idolized by some people. The English word idol has a couple of meanings. One is somebody who's adored, by many people. But I think there's a second meaning here too, which has, in the English word idol is often used as a synonym for a false god. He's not saying that Sultan Mahmud is a god. What is he saying? I think he's in some ways, even though he didn't use the term, we could say that Mahmud of Ghazni is almost a sort of false god of communalism, which was developing at the time as a political ideology, a kind of myth. And so that I wanted to use his phrase to talk about Mahmud of Ghazni. We all know, I think everybody knows some things about Sultan Mahmud. So, we know that, in the early 11th century, he invaded from Ghazni, which is today in Afghanistan, North India, and he's seen as this person who came and plundered and destroyed. And, since the 19th century, he's been seen by, a person who was motivated by religion, that he was a zealous, iconoclast. So, and that kind of image of him continues today. So he's kind of seen as a person who initiated, who launched what communalists believe is a sort of binary division in Indian history between Islam and Hinduism, what have you. So what I'd like to do today is to kind of speak a little bit about how people in the 19th and the 20th century have talked about Mahmud of Ghazni and different types of ways in which scholars have tried to deal with his legacy. Excuse me. And then I like to look at the sources. What is all this scholarship based upon? And then once we get through that, if I have time, I'd like to offer some alternatives. Excuse me. Sorry. So, we have to understand that the way we see Indian history wasn't always the case. In fact, especially from the time of the Mughals, first of all, if you look at the historiography of, say, the Delhi Sultanate, usually the histories that were being written were not histories of countries or nations. They were dynastic histories. That is, people would write to talk about a chain of kings and how the current king fits into this pattern. There was no such thing as nation because nationalism did not exist. So people did not think that the elites were necessarily equal to the masses or anything like that. As we do in a nation, everybody's supposed to be the same people. That idea did not exist. And what we find in the Mughal period in the 16th century is that especially under the auspices of Akbar, chronicles are written that treat all of the Indian subcontinent as one single unit. This was not common before. So you had regions. Hindustan was one thing, and the south was another thing, and so on. but the Mughals try to actually project this idea of Hindustan all the way down to Sri Lanka. So there's a kind of a India-wide notion of an empire. And so they write histories, right, to justify that. And starting in the early 17th century, after all this work was done under, in Akbar's court, you have other authors who then actually bring in the pre-Islamic period as well. So Firishta is probably the most well-known example. He's a chronicler. His family is Iranian. He lives in the Deccan, but he writes a history, and he uses, for the pre-Islamic section, translations of the Mahabharata. And at the same time, or actually a little before him, Muhammad Masum Bakari, he also brings in, as best as he can, the history of pre-Islamic Sind as part of his Persian history of that area. And this continues into the 18th century. There's a number of chronicles that keep doing this. And it's not really until the early 19th century where, if I may use the term, James Mill partitions that history, right? In other words, he, instead of having a single linear narrative from, what's discussed in the Mahabharata all the way down to the Ghaznavids and so on, and contemporary kings, he breaks down this dynastic history and makes it communal histories, right? So it used to be about kings, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, but now it's supposed to be about people. And also he separates them so that in his mind, there's a Hindu phase, the ancient phase, that ends. Then there is a Muslim phase, the medieval phase, and that ends, and then there is a British phase. So it's a kind of a partitioning of that single narrative that Indo-Persian authors, Muslim or non-Muslim, had been working with in the 17th and the 18th centuries. So that's the sort of the beginning of then looking for a moment, right, where the ancient ends and the medieval begins, which, thanks to Mill's way of thinking, was when the Hindu period ends and the Muslim period begins. Now, in the 19th century, this was a fairly common position to take, but already actually in the 20th century, there were scholars who began to question this. Not so much the division that Mill had posited, but at least they wanted to take away some of the religious explanations that had been offered. So probably the most common position, you already have this with like Alexander Haig and so on, is that they would say, okay, Mahmud did all this stuff, but really he was using religion in a kind of hypocritical way. And in reality, he was motivated by greed. And he just wanted to plunder. He just used religion to do this. And they would say, maybe he wanted legitimacy. As you may know, the Ghaznavid dynasty, to which Sultan Mahmud belonged, were actually founded by slaves, by Turkish slave soldiers from Central Asia. So at a time, again, this is pre-modern period, for somebody to be king, usually you either claim divine support or you claimed lineage. But the Ghaznavids didn't have lineage, right? So they needed at the time the caliph in Baghdad to give them legitimacy. So 20th century scholars said, look, Mahmud is not really motivated by religion. He wants to be legitimized by the caliph, and he wants to get money. So that's really what he did. So I suppose that approach, and that's a fairly common approach, we find it in a lot of textbooks and so on. That approach tries to take away religion and a simple division between Muslim and Hindu a little bit. But in some ways, it doesn't really go beyond the binaries, which I think are false binaries. Because the explanations that people who take that line, the explanations that they give is, they try to say, well, then why did he succeed? And usually people say, well, because the slaves were better disciplined, they had better loyalty, they had horses, and they had an egalitarian religion, and so they were better motivated. And their system was based on merit. So that's the kind of why he succeeded. And then they say, well, the Rajas of North India were disunited. They were an aristocratic system, which means the military position of their soldiers was not based on merit. And, they were not egalitarian and they didn't have horses. So, but the problem with that is that it assumes that they should have had a sense of unity based on their religion, that somehow Muslims were all one people and they were complete, and everybody kind of adhered to those values that I just mentioned. And Hindus were all one people and they were supposed to adhere to those values, and then they get blamed for not doing that. But if you think about the period that we're talking about, that is the post-Gupta period in North India, there are different dynasties and there are different city-states and everybody's fighting everybody else. People don't have a sense of a nation state, so they don't feel required necessarily to show loyalty to one king versus another. And if you were part of the allied lords of a great king, when that great king goes to war and you're supposed to come and help, maybe it's your benefit to actually wait and let them be defeated by their enemy, and then now you're more powerful than they are. So we have to think politics in the kind of an early medieval period and not in a national sense, where everybody who's on this side of the Indus is supposed to think we are one country and think of people on the other side as a different country. People don't necessarily think like that. There are different kings and hierarchies, and that's people make alliances based on their self-interest. So to me, that kind of explanation saying, it wasn't religion, it was simply greed, doesn't quite deal with what Mill had done, which is to, again, kind of think of two completely different people here being at war with one another and so on. So in kind of more recent times, other scholars begin to poke holes at this approach. For example, a number of authors, for example, Professor Syed Jabir Raza, Andre Wink has done this too. They start, and even actually as far back as Bosworth and others, they would say, look, it's not like there is one Muslim group and one Hindu group. And they show, for example, that there are many non-Muslims in the Ghaznavid system. The most famous you might have heard of is the General Tilak, who is he's a non-Muslim general who serves Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. So they would say, look, there are all these other things going on, and it's not such a sharp division between two people as well. And then other people came and they, again, criticized this approach. For example, John Key in his book on the history of India, and Richard Eaton has recently done this too in his book on the Persianate. And they say, look, they compare the actions, right, of the Ghaznavids in their invasions of North India, excuse me, with the actions of the Chola dynasty and other groups from the south. And they say, look, these people come to the north also and invade, and in their own inscriptions, they state very clearly that they do very similar things in terms of destruction and desecration and so on. And so the scholars who use this kind of comparison say, look, obviously it has to be modern nationalism that sees one group as villains and other people as kind of national heroes. Whereas in reality, at this time, they were probably seen perhaps similarly in terms of what they were doing and how they wanted to be seen. And so this brings us really to the 21st century. You might have heard of the book by Barry Flood, where he really takes this further and he looks at material evidence, and he actually shows that there was all sorts of cultural interactions between the Ghaznavids and the various Rajas that they had gone to war with. And he shows that, for instance, Sultan Mahmud, when defeating a Raja somewhere, he would give him a robe. And that means incorporation, which is what the caliphs were doing to the Ghaznavids too. Or there is a very interesting scene where after a peace treaty is signed, the ambassador from Mahmud of Ghazni asks for the Raja to give him a piece of his skin from his thumb or finger. And so again, sort of taking a part of the body. And again, we have to think, if I can use the word, medieval concepts of politics. The country is not a map right? Like the bird's eye view. The country is the body of the king. So when you become part of the kingdom, you become part of the body politic, literally, where the king is the head of the body politic, and then other individuals get put inside. I don't know if you've seen the cover of Hobbes's Leviathan. There's a picture on the cover of a king. He's got a big robe, and there are little kings inside his body, and that's the kind of idea that we're dealing with. So, getting a piece of skin from a defeated king or giving him your clothes, you're kind of making them part of the body politic. So, what does this mean? This means that obviously they're not just there to destroy and leave. Otherwise, why would they bother, right, making these Rajas part of their system and giving them these robes and so on? So it actually seems like they're doing something very different. And to me, it looks like a kind of an imperial construction. So the problem is then, we have to ask, well, how do we reconcile these different types of descriptions that different scholars have focused on? On the one hand, you have discussions of, in the sources of like Mahmud invading and destroying and killing and so on. On the other hand, you have these discussions of him incorporating people into his polity. So two different and perhaps seemingly irreconcilable difference and discrepancy. So I think that's why we have to go back to the sources and see what is it exactly that the sources say. And the question that I think has not really been asked, why were these sources written in the first place? What was the intent back in 1020 or 1050 to even, they weren't writing to inform us, right? They were writing to inform somebody else, and what was the goal? And maybe that helps explain the kind of contradictory evidence that seemed to show two very different things going on. Was it, peacemaking and incorporating, or was it destruction, or was it both? And what does it mean? And as Professor Rezavi said, the main sources that have survived, there is Utbi, Abu Nasr al-Utbi, who wrote an Arabic chronicle. It's a very difficult, flowery kind of Arabic, followed by Gardezi, who wrote a little bit later. He wrote in Persian. Utbi is writing in 1020, actually before the completion of all of Mahmud's reigns. And he's actually writing, for the court of Ghazni, and as we'll see, for other people as well. Gardezi writes in Persian. He is writing after the facts, but he claims to have either seen the stuff that he writes about or he heard from his friends. And then you have these other texts, Farrukhi, who was a poet at the court, and he actually accompanied the Sultan on his campaigns because he was part of the court. But I would say of all these texts, probably the most important was Utbi, because he's a contemporary historian, who wrote this text. And as I said before, the text is written in a very difficult, florid, some people have said verbose, Arabic, full of rhymes and metaphors, the kind of text that if you've looked at the sources from this period, you kind of have a sense of what it's like. And in fact, it was considered difficult enough that in the subsequent eras, it was first translated into Persian. So about 200 years later, in the early 13th century, a figure called Abu Sharaf Jorfadhani, he actually translated that book into Persian. And then the subsequent Indo-Persian or other Persian historians actually used this Persian text to discuss the Ghaznavids, whether it's Rashid ad-Din in the Mongol era, or Khandamir in the Timurid era, or the various say Mughal historians of a later period. Although I think it's significant that the Mughal historians, some of them actively decided to go with Gardezi and not with Utbi. And then the Persian, this Persian text was translated by Elliot, Henry Myers Elliot, and was published in excerpts by Elliot and Dawson in the famous A History of India as Told by Its Own Historians. and a lot of subsequent scholarship, but also I think kind of in popular or political writing, relies on Eliot's translation as a source as a kind of a major source for the Ghaznavid period. And this has been a real unfortunate problem, because Eliot was very clear why he was translating these passages. And he says very openly that it was propaganda. He wasn't, some people say that Eliot was a positivist. I don't think he was a positivist. I think he's actually, as he says himself, wants to write as political propaganda, specifically against the sort of nascent anti-colonial nationalist movement that was developing and came to full fruition in 1857. Okay, and I'm going to use his own words when he explains why he chose, this project. And he says he wanted to prove to bombastic, and then he uses a racist term, people. He says babu, bombastic babus who rant about patriotism. This is Eliot talking. That in the days of those dark periods, for whose return they sigh, even the bare utterance of their ridiculous fantasies for political freedom would have been attended with severe discipline of molten lead or impalement. Okay, what is he saying? He's saying that I guess he's talking about Bengali nationalists or whoever, that sounds like you guys are being nostalgic about the pre-British period. And of course, we kind of see this comes to a head in 1857 as the sepoys try to bring back the Mughal emperor, right? So they're trying to kind of get rid of the British and bring back the Mughals. And Eliot is writing before this, but is published afterwards anyway. So it's kind of between, in the sort of bookends the uprising. But he's saying, look, this thing that you guys are nostalgic about was bad. You would not have gained any political freedom. Our period is so much better. And what is he doing? He's actually splitting, right? He's trying to show that there is no point for Muslims and Hindus to both, sigh, as he says, for or be nostalgic about the Mughal Empire, because, as he wants to show, is the Mughal Empire is part of this Islamic thing, and they were not for political freedom. They were actually very repressive, right? So this is in his preface. This is why he's translating these passages into English. So it's no wonder that if we rely on Eliot's translation, we're always going to reify, right, this kind of binary communalist myth, which was, as he says very clearly, a kind of a racist colonial propaganda, and it was a kind of a divide and rule policy. So this is, I think, the reason why a lot of subsequent scholars try to not really deal with the Ghaznavid period at all, because they look at the text and say, well, it looks pretty violent. And so they say, well, okay, well, he was being a hypocrite. He was just coming and leaving. Let's just leave it, and then people want to move on. And, if you look at recent histories of the Delhi Sultanate, say Peter Jackson or the late Sunil Kumar, they avoid the Ghaznavid period. They say, well, he was just here. He was not here for territorial gain or anything like that. But I think if you go back and look at the Arabic text of Utbi, then hopefully we can get a deeper understanding of what the actual source is, not what Eliot wanted us to see in that source, but actually what they said. And so in some ways, I would say, what Eliot did is actually the opposite of positivism. Because positivism would look at all the sources, more or less critically, and they would take all the facts that they thought was a fact. And if you actually did that, you would find that there's a lot of different things going on than that a simple sort of caricature epic of conquest, as was these texts were called before. So let me talk about Utbi a little bit, if you don't mind. Utbi was he was actually a kind of a secretary in the Ghaznavid state. He was descended from family of wazirs, ministers that served the Ghaznavids. He writes this text, as I said, in Arabic around 1020. we know that when he's writing, he's fallen from favor by Sultan Mahmud. And he blames, he was working basically as a spy. They call them postal workers, but at the time, postal workers would inform on governors. So he was working as a spy in a certain region in Afghanistan, and he obviously doesn't get along with the governor that is in charge because he's spying on him. And so he blames that governor for his fall from grace. So he writes this text in Arabic. Now, on the one hand, the text is meant to impress the Sultan. Okay, so he said Utbi can come back to Ghazna and maybe get a good job. But if you actually pay close attention to the text, and a number of people have written about this, he is actually kind of unhappy. And he expresses his unhappiness through criticism a little bit of Sultan Mahmud. And he seems to have really liked Sultan Mahmud's father, who was Sebuktakin, who was a slave soldier. So the text kind of is a contrast between what he thinks is a good king, Sebuktakin, and maybe a more tyrannical king, which is Sultan Mahmud. So it's a panegyric, but also a criticism, right? So it's a little bit of a contradiction in there. We know that Utbi never went to India. So how did he know what he knew, right? If he never went to India, how did he write these passages that everybody has relied on? And Elliot and Dawson, publicized later on. So let's look at that issue. By the way, I should mention that part of the reason Utbi is writing, he seems to have had in mind, because he's writing in Arabic, very complicated Arabic. And the question we have to ask is how many people in the Ghaznavid Empire could actually hear or read and understand that text? And I would say that number would have been minuscule. So the real audience here is probably people in Iraq or other secretaries like Utbi who have mastery of this Arabic text. And there would have been very few probably in Ghazna and Khurasan and places like that. So in some ways, he's kind of justifying himself to his colleagues and also intending the court in Baghdad to read this and sort of sympathize with him. And he specifically mentions historians of the Buyids and so on who had written these texts about the Buyids, and they also had gotten into trouble. So that's the kind of audience he probably has in mind. Okay, so a lot of the text is about what happens in Khurasan or Afghanistan, but let's see how he knows what he knows about India. So let's look at his sources. Well, looking through this text, you can identify at least two sources of information for what he knows about India. If you look at everything that he knows, it's three. Obviously, one is things that he himself had seen, but he hadn't seen India, so that doesn't quite work for these sections. And then in the India sections, one is that he relied, because he didn't know, he had to rely on these letters that the Ghaznavid court was sending in from India. These are victory letters or victory proclamations, the Fatahnama. And then second, he would apparently talk to individuals who would come back and tell stories about what had happened. Okay, now, this is actually a very complicated source material, which would have been hard to harmonize, because the Sultan in his letters had a very specific goal and intention. Okay, obviously and we'll talk about this, to kind of show the Sultan in a powerful and victorious light. But then when you talk to other people, they're going to tell the story in a way that is not quite in harmony with what the emperor himself, with Sultan himself wanted. So, and then you have the author trying to combine these three. On the one hand, thinking, okay, I have to make sure I don't upset the king. On the other hand, they have their own intention when they write. So you have to actually take these very different and perhaps complicated, conflicting, contradictory information, which was not always in harmony with one another. Okay, so let's go through each of these and see what they actually say. Obviously, the most propagandistic material are the victory proclamations that the Ghaznavids were sending themselves from, the court was sending out from India. And I've looked at these in some, not earlier in other publications. And what's interesting about them is that they're very formulaic, okay? They follow a kind of an episodic nature. There are usually 7 stages to each one of these accounts. So they're very formulaic. And usually it starts with saying something like the Sultan, heard about something or, decided to invade. So there's a kind of an intention. The second stage is usually they have to cross some kind of natural barrier, a desert, a river. Third, they encounter something scary, whether it's like, plants that kind of tear their bodies, or, winds that's, kill them, or they hear about snakes that suck the life of sleeping people. So some kind of like danger, right? The fourth stage is they come and face the enemy and they fight the enemy. The fifth stage, this happens a lot, somehow the enemy, after being defeated, commits suicide. The next stage is they capture a fort with a lot of riches. And then the last stage is they come home with plunder. And you find this type of storytelling used in almost every one of Utbi's account of the Ghaznavid campaigns in India. And we know that these are specifically based on the letters sent by Mahmud himself. How do we know that? Because if you look at Arabic chronicles from Iraq and Syria, they actually say a letter arrived from Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni saying, and then they go list, in a simpler language, they list sort of the episodes of what had happened. And it's in these texts that we find the most graphic descriptions of violence in Utbi's history. Now, that doesn't prove that there was violence, okay? The only fact, right, is that the Ghaznavids wanted the caliph to think or to believe that there was violence in this manner. Just as I would bring back what I talked about a little earlier with John Key and Richard Eaton, that when they compare the Cholas with the Ghaznavids, how do we know that the Cholas did what they did? We don't know. All we know is that in Sanskrit inscriptions back at home, they wanted people who could read Sanskrit, presumably Brahmins, to think this is what they did. And the same goes for the Ghaznavids. They want the only fact that we know is that they want the Ghaznavid, the caliph in Iraq, to think that they behaved in this manner, that they're kind of destructive champions of faith. So why do they do that? As people have said, it's probably legitimacy. What kind of legitimacy? Well, when the caliph sees these letters, in exchange, he would send the Ghaznavids titles, or he would give them diplomas, or he would send them robes. So then they would kind of have this standing. And what does the caliph get out of this? He could then use the Ghazni, because the caliph at this time is beset by Shiite dynasties. The Fatimids have risen up in Egypt. The Buyids, who are Shiite dynasties, have actually occupied Iraq itself. And the caliph is almost like a puppet in their hands. So the only major Sunni power are the Ghaznavids. And so the caliph can then sort of use, in exchange for giving robes, he is using, these letters and this information to kind of prop up the Ghaznavids, to create a balance as much as possible in the Islamic world. So there's a kind of a give and take here that is achieved by this kind of reporting, by this kind of propaganda campaign that the Ghaznavids are engaging in. And if you actually look at these descriptions are written, they're not always static. So if you actually follow exact chronology, the earlier texts are not as graphic or as violent. They grow progressively more violent, and they show only attacks on temples in the later iterations, right? And what does this mean? What this means is that this is not just legitimizing, because a propaganda campaign might take, some facts and then exaggerate them, right? But it's also possible that they're intentionally distorting reality. that there actually is a campaign of misinformation, right? This is also equally possible, that the letters are not meant to just take what Mahmud is doing and exaggerating. It's quite possible that they're taking and sending information to create an alternative reality for political purposes. Now, why would I think that? And this is something that I wrote about in a paper about elephants recently. And I think it's connected to that in part. If you look at the Ghaznavids, they very early on learn about the importance of elephants and they use them extensively. But they don't just use it for practical reasons, battle or logistics or so on. They actually use it for symbolic reasons. The king, Mahmud, sits on the elephant and throws gold at people, okay? And even the chronicler Bayhaqi, when Mahmud dies, he says, the elephant lost its elephanteer, its elephant driver, meaning he sees the state as an elephant and Sultan Mahmud as the driver of that elephant, right? Now, they knew, if you look at Al-Biruni and other people, everybody knew that this is actually a very important symbol of kingship in South Asia. And Al-Biruni says specifically, talks about Indira and his white elephant as a symbol of sovereignty in South Asia. And we see this in inscriptions in South Asia and so on. So clearly the elephant stood for sovereignty, had this tradition of representing sovereignty. But what does the elephant signify in Islam? Actually the opposite. Satan, the hubris, the pride of evil kings. Why? Because in the chapter of the elephant, Surah Al-Fil in the Quran, there's a story that this Abraha, who was the king of Yemen, decides to destroy the Kaaba in Mecca. And so he goes up from Yemen with elephants. When he gets there, the prophet's grandfather at the time is the shrine keeper. And so he kind of steps out of the way. And Abraha then takes the elephants, goes to destroy the Kaaba. But then God sends these small birds called the ababil, and they throw these little pebbles on them, and they crush the elephants. And then that's used in, obviously in the Quran, but in subsequent texts, as a symbol of sort of the pride, satanic pride of kings and how God can punish them. And when you read Persian sources of the time, especially as the Ghaznavids bring elephants from India and use it in the Islamic world against other Muslim groups, this stuff starts to come up. And if you read the kind of genre of the tales of the prophets and exegesis and so on, we'll see that actually it was believed that the name of Abraha's main elephant was Mahmud. Okay, this is in Tarikh Bal'ami and Tafsir Tabari and things like that. So what that means is that this was written before Mahmud of Ghazni becomes king. This is a kind of mid-10th century discourse. So, what is actually happening is Mahmud of Ghazni is coming back with his elephants. And there are so many accounts in Persian and Arabic sources that the presence of the elephant was really jarring to Muslims, that he was using these elephants. And it was just too good. The elephant, Abraha's elephant was even called Mahmud. So as this discourse starts to develop, criticizing the Ghaznavis as these tyrants who use this kind of satanic tool, then the Ghaznavis have to do the opposite, right? You have to create the rhetorical opposite of what you come across as. Instead of, oh, I'm not Abraha, sitting on Mahmud, destroying Muslims. I am actually like the Prophet Muhammad, and I am destroying idol temples, just as Prophet Muhammad emptied out idols from the Kaaba. This is when you get the sort of idol smashing discourse of the Ghaznavids. And the way I know this is happening is if you follow the chronology of how these reports are presented, right? In Utbi's text, you can kind of see initially there's nothing about temples. It's only after the number of elephants reaches a certain number, and then you start to get these texts in the Islamic world criticizing, then he starts to say, no, I'm actually clearing idols out of temples. I'm like the Prophet Muhammad, okay? So you can kind of say this is not about reality. This is about fighting rhetoric with rhetoric. And then we've taken that, that sort of rhetoric that was meant to undo the anti-Ghaznavid propaganda and taking that as the reality of what actually happened and the only thing that actually happened. Whereas I think it's actually meant to distort. Clearly, if, as Barry Flood and Professor Syed Jabir Raza have shown, and Andrew Wink has shown, if they're incorporating Rajas after defeating them, and if he's using the elephant to show kingship, the audience, even though he knows that this is actually going to look back for Muslims, clearly the main intention of his kingship is to appeal to South Asian monarchs, North Indian monarchs. So if anything, I would say it's mainly an Indian empire with a nudge to the Muslims. It's almost like the opposite of what we think it was. Because otherwise, if he really cared about what his Muslim subjects think, he wouldn't use the elephant. But he clearly cares more what the Rajas in South Asia think of him than these other people. So, and then, we have to kind of see then that, Utbi's text then is, it contains this kind of propagandistic elements, right? And what's even more complicated, the whole point, I guess, is I think doing good history is often about nuance. And I think if we keep going down that path, we find that even the parts, the letters that are meant to show the sort of Islamic credentials of the Sultan are themselves based on pre-Islamic Persian tropes and notions of storytelling. For example, the kind of plot line, the seven sage thing, you find that exact kind of thing used in the Shahnama, the epic that Ferdowsi wrote about pre-Islamic kings and so on. And so it looks like they are using the plot lines of pre-Islamic Persian epic to kind of tell the story of Mahmud, as the great champion of faith, right? Because it's a kind of a heroic trope. Or even before him, there's a famous story, again, if you've read Professor Muhammad Habib's book, he talks about this. There's a battle between Mahmud's father, in the 10th century, Sebuktakin, and Jayapala, who was the Hindu Shahi king. And in the battle kind of goes on and it cannot be resolved. And so there is a lake, the text says, Utbi says, and this lake was like a holy lake, and it would not accept filth and any impurity. So Sebuktakin, we are told, takes a bucket of filth and throws it in the lake, and then this huge storm happens, and then Jayapala gets scared and he asks for peace. This is a strange story, especially in Utbi, who actually talks about in his preface how so many texts talk about bizarre supernatural things, which is not rational. If he has such a rationalist idea, why is he including this kind of story? And, well, if you read texts from sort of Eastern Iran and Afghanistan from the previous era, for example, there's a Persian text, The History of Sistan. There is a Zoroastrian text called Bundahishan. They actually talk about this. They say, in the area of Sistan and Zarang and Zabul and Kabul, there are lakes, there are holy lakes, and they actually say, if a freeborn holy man throws something into it, it'll be fine. But if any kind of impurity goes into it, then a storm breaks out. So what's happening is that in the victory letter sent by Sebuktakin to talk about his jihad against Jayapala, he's actually using pre-Islamic content. And so this makes it even more complicated, right, for Utbi, because the part that are propaganda and are supposed to show his, the patron's Islamic credential are themselves actually based on pagan or Zoroastrian material anyway. And as I said before, the authors themselves knew that this material had very tenuous relationship to reality. In fact, perhaps it was an alternative to reality. So that's sort of the, so that was the first set of sources that these authors use, letters from the court. But as I said before, we cannot actually use these letters in a straightforward way because they are creating an alternative reality, if I may, and they're actually based on tropes and contents that everybody knew was kind of folklore or mythological anyway. There's a second set of sources. I think I have some time. to talk about that. And these are information that came to these authors from other participants. And again, here, the people who are telling these stories don't necessarily know, right, what Mahmud of Ghazni wants. So they're going to tell the story in the way that fits them. So we have, for example, an account of Mahmud's, he went to a region and then there was a great snowfall and, they got stuck and a lot of people got frostbite and some people died, the animals died. And so Mahmud kind of has to wait for a while and then he comes back home. So this kind of shows Mahmud actually failing, right, to overcome this obstacle. And not only that, he's letting his men suffer in the snow. So that's clearly not something that the Sultan would have written in his own letters. And we know that Utbi was aware of this because he had given already an example of how Mahmud's father would have dealt with hardship by his soldiers. And there's another story about Sebuktakin that they were somewhere and they were stuck and there wasn't enough food. And the soldiers come to Sebuktakin and say, hey, we're hungry, can you help us? And so Sebuktakin says, you know what, I will share my own kitchen food with you all. And so he actually he himself cooks food and starts to dish it out to other soldiers who then eat it and they feel good. So there's a kind of a contrast, right, that you see. So these are kind of stories that are not putting Sultan Mahmud, obviously, in a good light. Or you might get stories from other participants. There's a general by the name of Abu Abdullah Muhammad at-Ta'i. And, Utbi has this account of how he was very brave and he fought the enemy. And, he took a lot of blows, but he withstood, the fight. And then he says, because the Sultan saw that, he wanted to raise his level. And he says, I quote, he says, the Sultan ordered him to be placed on an elephant. This is Ta'i being put by Mahmud on an elephant, out of regard for the pain of the injuries to his body. Thus, by the elephant, he was brought to the level of a king, right? In other words, this is a story of how this is probably not a story that Mahmud himself wanted to propagate, but somebody like Ta'i who was raised and was put on an elephant and is seen to be equal to the king as a result is being incorporated, showing that there was these other great heroes as well. And I think this is material we could probably call bardic material, sort of epic material and so on. And there were other kinds of stories like this, and you can kind of see them in other texts later on. Probably the most famous of them is the story of Salar Mas'ud Ghazi that Shahid Amin has written about. It doesn't seem to really be very much, it's seen as sort of like, perhaps mythical because it doesn't quite fit the right storyline that we expect from the Ghaznavids, and then it's kind of expanded upon. But there must have been a lot of stories like that. And, even if it looks mythical, I would say it's quite possible that it derives from another tradition that doesn't quite match what we expect the letters of Sultan Mahmud in Utbi. If you take that as reality, this stuff doesn't look like reality, right? But if you think they're all actually myths, right, propagated by different people, then it kind of makes sense. Mahmud is telling his own stuff, the other people are telling their own stuff. And then some of the stuff shows up later in the chronicles or in other accounts. So I think, let's see, it's 53 minutes. Maybe in the last few minutes, I'll just do a little comparison and contrast between Utbi and Gardezi, because Gardezi was writing later, so he wasn't under the thumb of Sultan Mahmud. Probably had a little bit more freedom in how he would tell the story, and so we find quite a different account in Gardezi of actually what kind of things were happening, and I think it's worth comparing the two. There's a famous story that has been used by historians, most recently by Barry Flood, about the battle between Sultan Mahmud and the ruler of Kanauj, which in the sources is sometimes called Nanda or Gunda, but probably his actual name is Vidyadhara. And the story is that, what had happened was Mahmud had defeated, a ruler, and he had then put his son in that place. in South Asia. And then Ganda had invaded and replaced that with his own candidate. So obviously Sultan Mahmud had to go and protect his, if I can call, feudatory sub-king. And according to Gardizi, he says when Mahmud first went there, he sent a message to Ganda, and I quote, counseling him and giving him promises in order to wake him up. He warned and admonished him, saying, become a Muslim and be safe from all this warring, suffering, and harm, end quote. And then on the eve of the battle, Mahmud is feeling nervous. And according to the text, he went up to the hilltop and saw the army of his enemy. And the text says, regret began to beset the corner of his heart. He kind of decided maybe this was a bad idea. When the day of the battle comes, Mahmud, again, instead of fighting, he wants to reopen negotiations. So he sends another messenger. But then this messenger comes to the camp and sees that the enemy has abandoned camp. And so then Mahmud kind of has a search. Maybe this is a trick. There's nobody there, so they take whatever is left and they go back. But then ultimately, as the story goes, Ganda and Nanda submitted, and then he wrote a poem for Sultan Mahmud in what Gardizi calls Hindavi, so some kind of North Indian vernacular. And it says Sultan Mahmud took great pride in this poem and had a robe sent to Ganda in exchange. This is a very different Sultan Mahmud, right? He is coming across as a kind of a gentler figure, more tentative. He's more accommodating. He seems to prefer peace to war. He can't quite make up his mind. So this is not how Mahmud wanted to be seen by the Abbasid court. And I think that's the difference, that if you take the different versions of the account, you'll find that the image that he wants to show to the caliph is quite different than the image that you find in other sources. Based on that, I would say the most violent and graphic parts are probably the least reliable parts. And actually the parts that do show accommodation and empire building and incorporation are in fact closer to reality, because they are the parts that the Sultan himself did not want to show and he was hiding. And I think then we kind of think, well, what is this Ghaznavid system? In some ways, Ghazna kind of fits the post-Gupta period. Similar to perhaps towns like Kannauj or other, where you have this kind of city-states, and then Harsha or somebody like that uses a city-state to kind of build an empire. And if you read this, text, Utbi, there's constant references to every time they would make peace. There would be, he would require allowing merchants to travel back and forth, right? So that there could be trade between Khurasan and India. So I think what essentially is happening is that the empire is Mahmud taking over, and he's called in the Persian poetry that is recited at his court, a king of kings, Shahanshah. So he's the king of other kings, right? So the big king defeats the little kings, and then they all become part of him in a way, kind of a hierarchy of king, which was, known from the Persian text, but was also very common and well known in the Sanskrit language context, both in inscriptions and the text from the period after 750, as Ron Indian has shown. And so the idea is you create a kind of a feudatory system, they pay tribute, and also you allow merchants to go back and forth. And then if you look at other scholarship, Walid Ziyad has written about this. The big temples he could clear out. The small temples are actually allowed to continue to work. There's a small Hindu temple in Kashmir, Smas, in what's today Pakistan. They're actually issuing Arabic coins. So, there's a kind of a level of activity happening below all this that is probably, and then there's a kind of ideology of King of Kings and Mahmud as the Elephant King. And, you read the stuff about what happens to his son Masood. Clearly, they see India as the more important part. So I guess the irony of this all is, this was probably the reality of what was happening, building an empire in the way that Harsha or somebody else had built an empire in the post-Gupta period. but then you had to kind of hide that for the benefit of the caliph. The irony is that modern scholarship began with that end, at the wrong end, and then built this image, which was the opposite of actually. In other words, they took the propaganda and the campaign of disinformation too seriously, to the point that we actually have the opposite image of what I think was actually happening than the reality. And I think I can stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali Anooshahr. I mean, you really gave us very interesting information how to look at Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. Uh, almost all the students of medieval Indian history who may or may not have read the book by Professor Muhammad Habib, but they have all heard about that book and the new trend which that book set as far as the history writing of medieval India was concerned. The Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University, 2 years back, uh, reprinted that book, and we tried to make it available because, uh, in spite of the fact that it is very brief, a very short account, but yet it tries to grapple with the sources and tries to interpret the account of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni and counter what Elliot and Dawson and others had tried to say. Thank you, Ali, for taking that dialogue forward. I mean, I found it very interesting in the sense that there are many things which are there in Muhammad Habib, but you further elaborated upon them. There were many doubts which I had after reading Muhammad Habib because he had not explained number of things. But from your talk today, which unfortunately once again was quite brief, naturally because such a talk can not be more than that, yet it was a very enlightening discussion which you did. I hope that you are ready to take up one or two questions which have been put up by the audience. I think you would excuse us today because unfortunately this is our first lecture, although it is, we have crossed 50 lectures so far. Probably yours is the 51st, but this is the first lecture which falls during Ramadan. And in India, generally the 7:30 is the time of iftar. So what I was seeing today is that a number of our audience, which traditionally used to join us, is today absent, and they were those who would ask a lot of questions. However, we still have a number of questions. I would request that they be placed on the screen so that we may have a look what has been asked. Shagufta, please go ahead. Ali Haider asks, um, although I think that doesn't relate. Sir, did Anglo-Afghan war play any role in antagonizing the reign of, demonizing the reign of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni by the Britishers? Yes.
Yes. Go ahead. Sorry. All right.
Uh,
I've heard that before. Yes, there was. I don't know the scholarship on that very well, but yeah, there was a sense that, sort of from 1817 onwards, sort of the interaction with the Afghans did indeed, contribute to depiction of Sultan Mahmud as this sort of evil, as a kind of a present day, Durrani or whatever. I've also heard people say that the invasion of Delhi by the Durrani also kind of played into that and kind of brought back. And actually, if you look at the Mughal sources too, they're uncomfortable a little bit with Timur, because that also kind of seems to fit. And it's the same Mughal chronicles like Badawani or Nizamuddin Ahmad or Tariq Alfi and so on. They're aware of this kind of connection, possibly. They don't want to see this connection between Timur, which was the founder of the dynasty, and Mahmud of Ghazni. And I think that's one reason why they kind of move away from using Utbi and they choose Gardizi instead. So there's probably in historical times, Mahmud of Ghazni that's why I think he's a kind of idol. He can be used as substitute for all sorts of contemporary political things, whether it's the partition, whether it's a nuclear weapon in Pakistan, or whether it's Timurids or the Durranis or so on. So I would say I don't know the specifics of your question, but I can kind of see how it fits a pattern a little bit.
Yeah, possibly the Durrani and attack of 1740s would have also played a role in creating suspicions in the mind of people and giving a chance to the English historiographers to build up a special image of people coming from that side and causing havoc. Let us have the next question, please. The next question. Hassan Aziz asks, Sir, Kara Khanate is considered a great period of cultural progress among Turks of Central Asia. Do we find its influence during the Ghaznavid period also? And as Warids and later Mongols had destroyed many Ghaznavid era heritage, do we have records present of where those buildings existed?
Yes, so yes, the Karakhanids are contemporaries of the Ghaznavids, and they're up in Mavara Nahr, Transoxania. It's kind of interesting. There are some things. There's buildings that have survived from their period, and they also patronize Turkish language material, like the Kutagdu Bilig, which is a kind of advice literature. It's a kind of early Turkish. A lot of people, as early as Bartold, people had considered that the relative cultural production of the Karakhanids is smaller than what was there before. And I think here we could maybe, I didn't get a chance to get into this, we can kind of look at the broader economic history of the period. Up until the 10th century, the people in Central Asia who are powerful are the Samanids. And the Samanid dynasty, how are they making their money? Agriculture in Central Asia, slave raids in Inner Asia, where they take Turkish slaves and sell them, but also silver mining. The Samanids use silver mines in Central Asia, and they issue coins, and they actually do trade with the Baltic all the way out to Russia and sort of the Viking states and so on. What happens is around the year 1000, the silver mines run out, and this is the period of, people call it the silver crisis of the 11th century. And I think this probably contributes to why the Ghaznavid state is formed. As the situation in Central Asia kind of collapses, the trade in the Indian Ocean is thriving. So it makes sense that of all the parts of the Samanid Empire, the most successful is the one that's the closest possibly to the Indian Ocean. And I think there was some early scholarship that was saying that really only in the Ghaznavid era we still find coins. So I think what's happening is that culturally, it's for Turkish language stuff, it's definitely, there's material about the Karakhanids, but I think the overall situation in Transoxania and Khorasan is actually one of economic depression. And then you find the Ghaznavid sort of trying to create this other trade zone with India. So maybe that's a little bit of a detour. So you don't really see the Ghaznavids engaging in promoting, Turkish language texts or anything like that. And again, because people of the early modern period don't have a sense of ethnicity that we do today, right? So you could be Sultan Mahmud, and you know, you might actually be able to speak Turkish of some kind, but you don't feel bound in any way to promote Turkish letters. You're going to promote Persian or Arabic because that's what's culturally relevant where you are as a ruler, right? In the way that, as Audrey Trushke has shown recently, the Mughals would promote Sanskrit, not because they're connected to any Kshatriya lineage. I mean, I guess the Shah Jahan and so on are connected to Rajput, but not because of their lineage, but because as emperors, this is what you patronize, right? So you don't see the kind of Turkish material that you find with the Karakhans, with the Ghaznavids. In terms of buildings and so on, there are actually things that have survived, and there's a new scholarship in Italy now that has I don't remember the name, but there's a Italian scholar who has actually created a new edition and translations of all the Ghaznavid inscriptions that have survived. So there's definitely people who work on that, and that's definitely material that should be included and incorporated. I can email you the title later if you'd like to share.
Please do that.
Mhm.
Right. The next one, Mirza Hassan has another question. As Seljuk Turks had become the de facto rulers of Abbasid Caliphate, don't we find in later Ghaznavid period Ghaznavids lessening their urge of seeking legitimacy from Abbasid Caliph?
Yes, that's a good question. I think with the later Ghaznavids, there is less of this reliance on the caliph. And maybe it's because the Seljuks, when they do take over Iran and Iraq and even beyond, if you read Nizam al-Mulk's, Siyasatnama, the text that he wrote, he was a vizier of the Seljuks, but he's very clear on, supporting Sunni Islam. Hanafi or Shafi'i are his favorite two mazhabs, and he says very specifically, you have to make sure that in the system that you're setting up here, we favor, Hanafi and Shafi'i ulama and scholars because they're more reliable. So I think once the Seljuks are there, the Abbasid Caliph is probably, again, as the further you move from the 10th century, the less actual power they have. And then they don't really need the Ghaznavids as much anymore because the Seljuks are there, they defeat the Buyids. And so I think the situation later on is a little bit different for sure. Oh, I forgot to mention, Mahmud himself actually thinks very lowly of the caliph. And in Bayhabi, we have an account that in Ghazna, a letter once comes from the caliph, and the caliph is angry, and he says that, Mahmud is angry at the caliph, and he says, oh, he's an idiot, or he's kharaft, he's an imbecile, or kind of somebody who becomes imbecile by old age. So personally, he doesn't really like the caliph, but he knows that he needs the caliph. And I think that's significant because it also shows you that in the court poetry that calls Mahmud Shah and the king of Kanauj and Sindh and so on, that's probably how they actually want to be seen. That's probably a little closer to how they want to be seen because that's not for the caliph's ear. So I thought I can add that.
There was a related question. I think you have almost answered it by Sudhir Ernesta. He had asked, one of his first questions was, to what extent was the caliphate the source and sanction to the legal authority of the sultans of it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we do find, I think, with Iltutmish, and I think maybe, if I remember correctly, with the Tughlaqs or the Khaljis also, they do get stuff from the caliph, and they're very proud of that, and they do display it. But I think by that time, especially in the post-Mongol world, and other scholars have written quite a lot about this. I think I can think right away of some of the writings of Professor Sunil Kumar, that essentially Delhi is supposed to be the new sort of heart of Islam, given the fact that the Mongols have taken over Baghdad and places like that. So throughout the Delhi Sultanate, again, the idea of the caliph is still something. And you see it, I think, with the Mamluks of Egypt too, that people want to have some kind of Abbasid descendant around. it's useful to have. Yeah. There was a question about the jots that was just up.
We will come to that.
Okay.
We will come to that. Ali, I mean, I would just add to what you have said on the same issue. It may be, I mean, you may be able to answer a query which I have regarding that. Barry Flood in his book, that famous book of his, if I remember correctly, and you may correct me if I am wrong, he says that the Ghaznavids sent to the Abbasid court a number of trophies which were of Ismaili origin, and he also sent a number of idols there which were then buried in front of the palace of the Khalifa, or so that people might trample on top of that. But on the other hand, I mean, on one hand, I mean, this is what the Ghaznavids are doing. But on the other hand, we know it well, and it is recorded that they issued bilingual coins with legends in Sanskrit as well as Arabic, as well as the name of the Ghaznavid ruler on one side and the idol of a goddess on the other side. So, why this dichotomy? Would you try to clear it? On the one hand, you are sending the idols to be trampled upon. If that is just a claim, then probably. But then on the other, what is legitimately there and which cannot be denied by as an imaginative thing is the issuance of such coins. Any comments on your end?
Thank you. Yes. Yes, he does. I am aware that he sends trophies. I think the idol that you mentioned, I think that's actually in Ghazna itself. Supposedly it's buried under. And
Okay.
I think it was Professor Romilo Tapper who said that no excavation has found any idols in Ghazna at all. So it seems to be again a kind of a statement of like, look at what great things we did and we step on this thing. But actually doesn't seem to be, as far as excavations are concerned. There's no statue buried in these Ghaznavid ruins that have been found. So, that kind of, I think the trophy sending obviously has a particular message that look at what great things we're doing here. But I think the bilingual coins are interesting. Yes, the bilingual coins are issued. There's more than one of them. I think Thomas was the first one who saw these back in the 19th century. And they have the statement of faith on one side in Arabic, and they have the name of the caliph and the title of Mahmud, which is Yamin ad-Dawla, which is the right hand of the state, the title. But on the other hand, it's in Sanskrit. It's, talks sort of, instead of saying, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, so on, they say Avakam, which means one. And then they refer to the prophet as an avatar. And they refer to Mahmud as Narpati, king. And the place of publication issuance is a town called Mahmudpur, which is supposed to be Lahore. Now, again, that's Bosworth, I think, had already said that the area of Western Punjab seems to be under direct administration, and that's where this coin is found. And that's where you find the Kashmir Smast in so that area of Pakistan issuing Arabic, Hindu temple issuing Arabic coins. So I think, as a matter of fact, those kind of statements are probably more subdued even than probably what's happening in Veraval and Kalinjar and Gwalior and places like that. Because I think probably there he's seen as a Maharaja or Raja Dehiraja. That's probably how he's coming, but he's not putting that on coins that can be seen. So what's happening is that in the more direct administration there is, there's a kind of a spectrum. If you're dealing in Khorasan and like Western Iran, and if you're sending stuff to Iraq, you hype the Islamic rhetoric. If you go east into Western Punjab, then you start to have the bilingual coins, Sanskrit and Arabic. Beyond that, it's probably even more appealing to the, and it makes sense because it's not a modern nation state where you're supposed to have one people, one ideology, one everything. Whatever you are, you appeal to the people in the way that makes sense to them and applies to their values. And so, like Bayhavi, for instance, says specifically that tilak that we mentioned, Tilak and this individual called Birbal were initially translators, which means that they were probably issuing bilingual documents, revenue documents in these areas as well, Persian and Sanskrit or something like that. So, otherwise, why would you need to have a translator? And he calls Tilak a Dabir. So he was a kind of administrator before he becomes a general. So you can kind of imagine Tilak, who's the son of a barber, first gets a job, learns probably Persian or Arabic, knows something of Sanskrit or some similar language. And then he is sent somewhere where they're issuing, as a Dabir, right? They're issuing administrative documents bilingual, which would not have survived. So I think, yes, all of this only makes sense if you have a kind of obviously complex, not systematic, but definitely a kind of an imperial system of governance. And that makes sense. You go to war, you defeat your enemy, and then you put them back in their place. They're now feudatory kings to you, and then you have these coins and documents.
Next question, please. Do we have the next question, please? Next question, please.
While we wait, I can answer the question about the Jats, if that's okay.
It's not happening.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead with the Jat question.
Yeah, and I'll come back to this question. That's a really important question, and as I mentioned earlier, Professor Syed Jabir Reza, who was on your program earlier, he's actually written about this. You find the Jats actually, initially, they get defeated by the Ghaznavids, but then later on, they actually serve the Ghaznavid cause. And the particular story is the story of Ahmad Yunaltagin, who is a kind of a Turkish slave general, and he's put in charge of his, he's called Salar Hindustan, the commander of India. And when Mas'ud is kind of in Khorasan, Ahmad apparently rebels. And so Mas'ud, that's Sultan Mahmud's son, sends Tilak, that we just mentioned, and he's the commander of, he calls them Indians, Salar Hinduan. So there are actually contingencies. When Mahmud defeats the various people, part of the peace agreement is that they have to send soldiers to Ghazna on an annual basis. So then Tilak and these soldiers go after Yunaltagin. And Yunaltagin hears about this, and he goes to the king of Bhatia and says, I need to get across the Indus and go to India. But the king of Bhatia, because he's loyal to the Ghaznavids, says, okay, but he puts them on boats and sends them to an island on the Indus and leaves them there. And they think initially they have reached the other side, then they realize they're being stranded. And so once they wait there a while and they lose all their food, then Tilak comes and attacks them. But Bayhaqi says specifically that he was helped, and the people who actually killed Ahmad Yunaltagin were the Jats. So this is very important because you also find this in Khorasan as well. The Ghaznavid army is not a national army. It's an imperial force. So what you find is, and the German scholar, Professor Jürgen Paul, has written about this, there are, part of what they do is you just mobilize as many people as you can. And they're not there to serve the king or the state. They're just there to serve their own command structure. So there are peasants in Khorasan who are armed, who are part of these invasions. And they're not necessarily loyal to Mahmud. They're there for their own cause. But they're just kind of serving under the great, larger umbrella. And you kind of see when the Ghaznavids get to India and they subjugate those areas, then same method is applied. And the peasants, the militarized peasants of South Asia are also now serving the Ghaznavid cause. And Bayhaqi says specifically that Tilak actually paid them money. So they were, so and I think, so essentially, if I can go back to the big economic activity, we know that the peasants in Khorasan are becoming armed and uprooted because of the economic problems of the silver crisis. And what happens is that the soldiers start to overexploit because they're not getting paid, and the peasants are becoming desperate, and they're choosing banditry as the way of making money. So what the Ghaznavids is, they're taking all these people and moving them all to India. And then as they get there, they take the peasants there and then mobilize them. So essentially, you could say the Ghaznavid state in India is made up by the help of mobilized peasants, merchants, and probably smaller temples and individuals like Tilak who are from the lower social classes, and this creates an opportunity for them. So the dot question, I think, is interesting to put all the stuff that are happening in the bigger context.
Right, so there is a question by Lakshmikant Mishra. Lakshmikant Mishra asks, how and when did elephants capture the imagination of the sultans when they symbolize the same with state and power? From Yemen to Afghanistan, a long canvas, both in terms of time and space. Would you kindly elaborate more?
Thank you.
And then he goes on to praise you. It's a fascinating lecture which you delivered.
Thank you very much. The elephants, the elephants show up a lot in the sources of the period. The Sasanians had actually elephants in their army. And if you read the early Islamic conquest narratives, there is a lot of references to the Persians having had elephants in their ranks, and then the Arab soldiers sort of fighting the elephants and then, overcoming the elephants or throwing spears at the elephants and so on. And the elephant is used, it is mentioned also in sort of pre-Islamic Iranian stuff a little bit as a sort of obviously powerful animal. The white elephant, everybody considered to be a kind of a superior elephant and so on. But at the time of when the major incorporation of the elephants by the Ghaznavids, I think it's the biggest influx of these animals that we see in the Eastern Iranian world, at least, since the Sasanian times. And you kind of see the sources reacting to this very, in a kind of a visceral way. Muslim sources the elephants are there to scare people. There's a account in the Arabic Tarikh Samarkand, which is a account of the ulama of Samarkand. And apparently one of these imams of Samarkand, when he sees a Ghaznavid elephant, he has heart attack and dies on the spot because it's so scary and so on. So it creates this idea of this terror that the Sultan has these big, large, loud animals. And it's definitely, you kind of see why they quickly switched to this idea of this demonic thing. So it is used sporadically, and the Abbasids have it. We have to also understand that the Asian elephant is easier to tame and use than the African elephant. So there's a very good chance that Abraha's elephants are not African elephants. So they're probably Indian elephants that have been shipped on the sea. We know this can happen later in the Jahangir Nama. Jahangir mentions that baby African elephants came, and he saw one at court, and he remembered Akbar having one too. And he says, oh, they have bigger ears, but they're very unruly and they're very hard to control. So probably even Abraha's elephants must have been, Asian elephants that were exported.
There's a question by Tarun Mathur. Sultan Mahmud took several helpers and slaves from India. What happened to them? Can their descendants be traced?
I don't think their descendants can be traced because there would be no memory. And again, in pre-modern times, people assimilate very easily within a generation or two, and most people don't remember. Most people don't know who their great-grandparents are. And most of us probably wouldn't be able to name all 8 of them or all 16 of them. So these things disappear quite fast, and it wouldn't show in any kind of DNA test because after the 6 generations, the genetic contribution is 1%, and then half of them 1%, and then disappears. And of course, in pre-modern times, you don't have biology, you have genealogy. So it doesn't really matter, like the mother's side doesn't even count. People only count their father's side, even though genetically you get equal from your father and mother. So it's not really clear where are the descendants, where they are. And then to that, you would add the complicated situation, not complicated, but the situation of slavery in Islam, that essentially a child born to a slave mother but a free father is free and is in fact a descendant of the father and is entitled to inheritance. So, very, very quickly, the children, if there were any children, would become part of the descendants of their parents. And I would think there wouldn't be anything visually distinguishable between their descendants and other people.
Tarun Saab had asked this question to Professor Jabir Raza also. But before we start with the question of Nilanjan Sarkar, let me add to what Tarun had asked. And that is that, fine, very good, that the descendants of those who had migrated there are very difficult to be found. But what about the physical remains of the structures which are said to have been created in the region of Ghazni by those Indians who established themselves there? We are informed, if I remember correctly, that there were certain neighborhoods with some temples also which were constructed. Are there any remains which can be identified with with that period?
Yes, there are. There is definitely stuff. I know the literary sources from the 10th century, and like the Hudud al-Alam, which is a geographical text of the 10th century. This is right before the Ghaznavid period. And they actually mention most of these towns that the Ghaznavids set up their state in, Kabul, Ghazna, and so on, actually had large Hindu populations. That what the Persian authors called Hindu, whatever. It would not be the self-identification of the people themselves. And in fact, there is an interesting notice in the Hudud al-Alam. It's written at the end of the 10th century, probably the source for it is earlier, that there was a famous temple in Kabul, and the king of Kanauj would not, this is what the text is, this is the king of the Rai of Kanauj would not consider his reign complete until he had made a pilgrimage to this Kabul temple. So I can kind of imagine that, again, if you take over these areas, now you're the king of these people. And so they might actually come to pilgrimage where you are. And there's certainly neighborhoods in Ghazna. There's garrisons of non-Muslim soldiers that are all over Ghazna. Bayhaqi mentions, people at court who are from India. Sultan Mahmud, he says he has musicians from Hindustan. So yeah, this would be and so already, if you think about the area where they go, Ghazna, Gardez, Kabul, these are actually areas of recent Islamization. So there would be large numbers of Buddhists, what we call today Hindus, probably Zoroastrians. There are people who are just called pagans, and they are pagans when Babur goes to India. So it's again, this image of like enforcing religion or anything like that is very unlikely.
Well, let us have the question of Nilanjan Sarkar. Nilanjan Sarkar asks, I agree in principle with your argument that texts have intentions, are written for target audiences, and rhetoric and discursivity play a serious role in intention. I also understand why and how Henry M. Elliot amplified certain aspects of Mahmud of Ghazni. What is curious is, if Mahmud wanted to project a different message and symbolism to Rajas of India, why do Muslim historians like Barni use Mahmud's Ghazi image, which you argue was for the Caliph in Baghdad rather than for the other audiences?
That's a good question. So I would say that the way that Mahmud would communicate his reign to different audiences are, if I can say, genre specific. So in the Fatahnama, or the victory proclamations, or certain chronicles, there's a particular type of presentation. On the coins, there's another type of presentation. I can imagine that there's probably ways of showing your kingship to the Rajas that are not textual. That actually, and Japanese scholar Minoru, I think Ibara is the name, he has shown that it was really important for the Ghaznavis to be constantly moving around their kingdom. Because what you do is you show up, you collect supplies, you interface with the subjects, you hold court so people can come and complain and so on, and you do hunts. And that's how you communicate the primary way to these Rajas. So what you have is, the German philosopher Heidegger, he had an interesting metaphor. He says, if you look at a table from one angle, all you see is 3 legs. You'll never see the 4th leg. You have to really walk to the other side to see that there is a 4th leg. You just have to go to the other side and look at it. So, I think that's how they're communicating through. These campaigns are actually how they're communicating with these rajas. And as Flood has shown, as material evidence kind of shows how this is happening. Exchange of robes, exchange of little piece of skin. This is how you're showing up on the elephant, doing lion hunts on the elephant's back. This is how you communicate to these, if I can call them, feudatory kings. Now, the Persian sources or the Arabic source, Utbi, has a particular discourse. Obviously, in the Perso-Arabic discursive tradition, that's the text, right? That is then borrowed by other historians. But even if you think about the period of the Delhi Sultanate, from the time of Iltutmish, let's say around 1200, to Timur's sack of Delhi, how many actual histories in Persian do we have? We have the Fakhr Mudabbir, Adab al-Harb, we have Juzjani, we have Barani, Tariq Firuz Shahi, which is actually written after, right? What is that, 4 texts in 400 years? So clearly, this is, there's Amir Khosraw too, I guess you can call it historical text. So that's a very few numbers of text, if you think about it, in a 400-year or 200-300-year period. That could not have been the main way for the state to have communicated to its subject populations. So the Persian texts, in some ways, happen to be hegemonic, if I can use Professor Tupper's language, because they're the only ones that kind of give this kind of accounts. But if you see how few they are, I think that there was a whole range of imperial expressions in the Sultanate and the Ghaznavid period that have no textual remains. And this is where we would find, and you might get glimpses of them in the Persian text, but I would not look at these texts as the dominant way in which the state communicated to its subjects. I would look at these as how the very small Persian reading, right, audience understood and try to make sense and in some ways invent what the Delhi Sultanate was. I don't know if that makes sense.
Right, Sayyid Ali Kazim, Dr. Sayyid Ali Kazim asked, Buyids and Fatimid sources must have negative depiction of Mahmud. And then he goes on to ask, how could Mahmud have avoided being detected by Buyids when used to have direct relationship with Al-Qadir, the Abbasids?
Well, that's a good question. The Buyid, so the main Buyid source by Miskawai is, if I get the date right, is actually just before Mahmud of Ghazni. And then you have the kind of Sabi family of As-Sabi, of chroniclers, and these haven't survived. But they have been quoted by later Arab historians, like there's a person called Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, who says, oh, okay, this is what what was quoted in As-Sabi's text, or the Zail of Sabi's son, or whatever. And then that's where they find this report of the letters arriving. So, I don't know exactly what, I guess as far as I know, we don't know exactly what the Buyids thought of the Ghaznavids, because those main sources have only survived in later quotations. So then, unless there might be contemporary sources that I just don't know about. But of course, the Buyids and the Ghaznavids would go to war with one another quite often. So I'm sure they did not think highly of each other. But the Fatimids, that's a great question. I don't know what the Fatimids thought of the Ghaznavids. That would be really good to know, and I will look that up, how they discussed the Ghaznavids. But in terms of the Buyid sources that have been discussed by later historians, actually, that's how we know that the letters of Mahmud would arrive from India to the Caliph and mention these things. So, yeah, I think it's possible that, we probably won't know that well. It probably requires a whole research agenda right there to see what we can find out about that.
Right, sir. And the last question by Dr. Ali Kazim. is in terms of being Turkish in origin, the Kara Khanids and Ghaznavids were of the same origin. How far the Seljuks were different from both of them?
Well, in terms of, I don't know if you mean in terms of self perception or in terms of how they're portrayed in the sources. In terms of self perception, the Ghaznavids, they know that they're descendants of slaves, but they don't, what do they say about their origins? There are some accounts, especially from Sebuktakin, that are supposed to be what he said about himself. They're usually in the first person voice. And he says that he lived in this part in like Turkestan and then he was captured. But what you find in a lot of sources, they connect, like Juzjani does this. They say, oh, okay, well, he was up there, but he was a descendant of this Sasanian king who had gone there in the 5th century or something like that. And I think the idea is that the kings don't quite have the same notion of, or are not depicted in the same notion of what we consider to be ethnicity as so it's a kind of a lineage. So sure, this Juzjani says Sebuktakin was from Turkestan, but he was actually a descendant of like Yazdegerd, the Sasanian king, or something like that. And obviously, the Ghaznavis don't identify as Turk in the sources that I've seen. The Seljuks, maybe more so, they're identified as such, and they do have these sort of genealogies that go back to like Japheth and things like that. So they seem to embrace that much more than the Ghaznavids do. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ali Anooshahr. It has been a really very pleasant evening with you. Uh, we learned a lot from what you spoke to us today. I was reminded of one of the episodes which is quoted by Muhammad Habib in his Mahmud of Ghazni, the book. I actually read it many years back. So if I am wrong somewhere, so please do correct me. That possibly it was in the verses of Sadi that one of the verses speak of when Mahmud died. People saw that when his buyer was being taken out, his eyes were rotating all around, looking for the wealth which he had collected. This verse, in fact, goes to prove the correctness of your argument that the sources of the Ghaznavite period, which you mentioned, which are contemporary, they try to create an alternative narrative or reality. When you tell us about the episode of Abraha and his army and how that army is perceived by the Muslims, and the fact that Sultan Mahmud was using the elephants to, humiliate and overawe his Central Asian enemies, and if I am correct, then this
Looks like we briefly lost connection with Professor Rezavi. Let's wait for a bit and
Sure.
I think there's a bit of a lag there. Um, in the meantime, lots of people are thanking you, and it was indeed a brilliant lecture. If we don't have Dr. Rezavi here, I think what he was trying to recount, can you make a comment on that?
I think, yeah, he was, I guess, summing up the point that, contemporary Persian sources often are very critical of Mahmud. And, Professor Habib's book, I do remember that he actually takes this passage from Bayhaqi where I think it's when the Ghaznavis are defeated or something like that. Masoud wants to give money to one of these people at court. And he says, oh, I got this money through legitimate means, through holy war in India. And he says, you know what? I'm a good Muslim and I don't know what you actually did. And I'm not going to take this money from you. So, yeah, Professor Habib was, Muhammad Habib was very sensitive to these sort of critical strands, I think, in contemporary Ghaznavid writers. And yeah, I guess it ties to why it was important for the Ghaznavis to try to make themselves look good.
Thank you so much. And we've had a fabulous evening. It's been an hour and 45 minutes plus. So here is Professor Rizavi. I'm going to get him back on the stream. Sir, can you hear us? Professor Rizavi, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, suddenly because of a storm going on outside, the internet just disappeared. So I'm sorry. What I was saying was that such incidents do prove your theory that possibly there was an alternate narrative which was being constructed by the sources of that period. I must thank you a lot. I had many other things to say, but we have taken enough of your time. And, due to this disturbance also, let us not further carry on with it. I'll just thank everyone who joined us. And Ali, I'm really personally thankful to you that you took time off to be with us today evening. We really benefited a lot, and I think have you written on this particular theme? I think you have an article apart from the one on the elephants which you had written. I think they are a must for all the students of the Ghaznavite period to actually read them to understand what happened in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Good
you very
night.
much for
Thank you.
inviting me. Thank you. Good night.